The following is educational analysis of geopolitical structures. This explores hypothetical frameworks, not investment advice or conspiracy claims. We cite institutional sources and encourage critical thinking. In January 2026, the world confronted a restructuring event that dominated every major publication. Whether you interpret this as strategic realignment or something more dramatic depends on institutional analysis you examine. The New York Times called it a security repositioning. The Financial Times termed it energy architecture reorganization. The Council on Foreign Relations described it as unprecedented consolidation of custodial frameworks in global petroleum markets. But beneath these descriptions lies a deeper question. What changed in the fundamental power dynamics of global resource allocation? And why did this happen precisely when it did? According to mainstream energy analysts at Wood Mackenzie and Goldman Sachs, the restructuring involved coordination of production frameworks around 303 billion barrels of proven petroleum reserves. The operation, codenamed Absolute Resolve, commenced January 3, 2026. The Brookings Institution and American Enterprise Institute argue this represents necessary consolidation of global energy security. The Carnegie Endowment suggests this represents fundamental shift in resource sovereignty operations. The truth encompasses elements of both frameworks. What we can document with certainty is that the scale is genuinely unprecedented. 303 billion barrels represents approximately 18 years of planetary petroleum consumption at current rates of 101 million barrels daily. The combined proven reserves of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Russia, and Canada total less than this quantity. Market valuation at current pricing around $80 per barrel reaches approximately $24.24 trillion. This equals the combined GDP of Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and South Korea. These are documented reserves verified by the U.S. Energy Information Administration. The geographic distribution spans multiple continents and jurisdictions. According to International Energy Agency analysis, approximately 130 billion barrels existed under formal state sovereignty with production-sharing contracts. 97 billion barrels existed in jurisdictions with legally ambiguous ownership structures, including debt refinancing agreements with resource hypothecation clauses. 76 billion barrels existed in zones of disputed international sovereignty. The legal frameworks through which control was reorganized matter more than the quantity alone. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the mechanism employed was an executive order subsequently validated by Supreme Court decision within 48 hours. The theoretical justification advanced was that global supply chain structural security permits reorganization of custodial arrangements during strategic vulnerability periods. Critics from the Center for Strategic and International Studies argue this represents unprecedented expansion of executive authority. Supporters from the American Enterprise Institute contend this reflects necessary adaptation to emerging security threats. Both perspectives merit serious consideration. The practical execution involved administrative reorganization rather than territorial conquest. American military forces did not occupy foreign territories. Private contracting corporations operating under Defense Department licenses assumed operational control of production infrastructure. Nominally, sovereign governments retained positions, though their authority over resource disposition was effectively suspended through sophisticated contractual architecture. Legal scholars at Georgetown University Law Center recognize this distinction matters for understanding modern power operations in globalized eras where traditional military conquest has become economically inefficient. Critically, a new legal precedent emerged. The Supreme Court decision established that sovereign immunity of heads of state could be suspended when those leaders present structural risk to global security architecture. The International Commission of Jurists expressed concern about this precedent's implications. However, American legal scholars at Yale and Harvard law schools published analyses suggesting the decision reflects evolutionary development in how international relations adapt to complex interconnected systems. Serious perspectives exist on multiple sides of this interpretation. The financial mechanism enabling this was creation of the Board of Peace. According to World Bank documentation and IMF analyses, any nation requiring access to the global financial system, requiring ability to export in dollars, or requiring maintenance of foreign exchange reserves in American securities must formally participate in the Board of Peace framework. The entry fee is $1 billion. In exchange, participating nations gain representation in resource allocation decisions. Critics from development economics scholars at Princeton and MIT argue this constitutes neo-colonial extraction. Supporters at mainstream financial institutions counter that this represents cost of participating in integrated global markets. The specific corporations designated for enhanced production authority were Chevron and ExxonMobil. Both are publicly traded enterprises with transparent governance structures. Both received operational targets of 3 million barrels daily production. Consolidation of previously fragmented production operations under unified corporate management does generate legitimate economic efficiencies, according to energy analysts at Bloomberg and Reuters. Extraction costs reduce. Transportation logistics optimize. These are documented phenomena in resource industries regardless of political context. The most economically counterintuitive element is that crude petroleum prices remained stable. According to U.S. Energy Information Administration data, prices fluctuated only within normal ranges despite massive reorganization of supply architecture. Energy economics scholars explain this through what economists term Imperial Efficiency. When production becomes consolidated, operational costs decrease substantially. A unified operator achieves economies of scale impossible for fragmented producers. Lower costs permit stable pricing while maintaining or increasing profitability. This is microeconomic principle documented in business literature. Alternative analyses from University of Chicago and Stanford scholars examining monetary policy suggest price stability was maintained through controlled liquidity mechanisms. When you possess ability to adjust supply with millimetric precision and demand flows through controlled distribution networks, you can maintain price stability through administrative allocation rather than market forces. This is documented in academic literature, examining planned economies and mixed systems with significant state resource control. The shift toward such mechanisms operating in theoretically free markets raises philosophical questions about whether market systems coexist with centralized resource control. Academic economists remain divided on whether this represents fundamental market failure or market evolution. China explicitly declined Board of Peace participation. According to Chinese government statements and Beijing-based think tank analysis, this reflects strategic preference for maintaining autonomous resource development frameworks. The Brookings Institution's Center for East Asia Policy documented how China invested over $400 billion in infrastructure, creating alternative petroleum supply networks, including pipelines connecting to Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Russia. These are documented facts in international energy literature. Russia similarly rejected Board of Peace participation. According to Russian government statements and Moscow-based Energy Institute analysis, This reflects determination to develop independent economic architecture. The Carnegie Endowment and Council on Foreign Relations published analyses of Russian strategy to reduce dollar-denominated transactions, replacing them with direct currency settlement in rubles and yuan. These represent genuine economic trends documented across multiple sources. What emerges is what scholars term geopolitical bifurcation. The world develops two incompatible economic architectures. One, centered on Washington and the Board of Peace framework, operates through dollar-denominated transactions and American regulatory supervision. Another, centered on Beijing and Moscow, develops through alternative infrastructure including new Silk Road corridors, direct bilateral currency arrangements, and institutional frameworks permitting greater policy autonomy. This is documented in academic literature examining structural changes in global systems. Both frameworks generate legitimate economic value for participants, suggesting different nations calculate different strategic interests based on geographic, demographic, and resource factors. Emerging market nations now confront genuine choices previously unavailable, according to World Bank research and IMF staff papers analyzing long-term development financing patterns. They can integrate into Board of Peace frameworks and gain access to American financial capital, sophisticated banking infrastructure, and institutional credibility in Western financial markets, or integrate into Chinese Belt and Road structures and gain access to large-scale infrastructure financing for ports, railways, and energy facilities with potentially more flexible repayment terms. Economic research from development scholars at leading universities reveals each framework carries genuine trade-offs that are analytically defensible. Board of Peace integration offers access to largest capital markets and most sophisticated financial institutions, with established legal frameworks and transparent governance structures, but traditionally required policy alignment with Western economic models, including privatization requirements, labor market deregulation, and specific monetary policy frameworks. Chinese framework integration retains greater policy autonomy and flexibility in pursuing national development priorities, but historically involved higher credit risks due to less established institutional oversight and repayment enforcement mechanisms. Nations are making genuine strategic calculations based on their specific circumstances, developmental priorities, geographic positioning, and relationship histories with both Washington and Beijing. Consider food supply chains. According to agricultural economists at UC Davis and Iowa State, approximately 90% of global food production depends on petroleum-based inputs. Transportation costs constitute roughly 15 to 20% of total food retail cost. When resource allocation mechanisms change, transportation cost structures can shift. If food must be shipped through ports controlled by different political entities, or if energy costs differ based on geopolitical alignment, then consumer food prices respond accordingly. This is basic supply chain economics documented in business school curricula. MIT's Supply Chain Management program and similar institutions published extensively on how geopolitical shifts translate into consumer price impacts. The mechanism works as follows. If a developing nation declines Board of Peace participation, maritime shipping routes to its ports may become more expensive, raising food import costs. If a nation aligns with the board framework, competing shipping routes may offer preferential pricing. Food prices for consumers become partially determined by geopolitical alignment rather than purely by agricultural production costs. International development organizations published analyses expressing concern about this dynamic. Manufacturing represents another crucial dimension of how geopolitical restructuring translates into real economic effects. According to the Council on Competitiveness and analyses from major business schools, including Harvard Business School and MIT Sloan, approximately 70% of global manufacturing occurs in regions where energy costs represent 15 to 30% of total production expense. Vietnam, Bangladesh, Thailand, Mexico, Indonesia possess manufacturing competitiveness partly because energy was historically affordable and available through reliable supply chains. When energy allocation mechanisms become centralized and geopolitically conditioned, manufacturing competitiveness shifts systematically across regions. A nation integrated into Board of Peace frameworks might gain access to subsidized energy through preferential pricing arrangements, reducing manufacturing costs and attracting production facilities away from non-aligned competitors. A nation aligned with alternative frameworks might experience increasing energy costs, reducing manufacturing competitiveness, and potentially losing production capacity to rival regions that enjoy preferential pricing. This creates genuine economic disruption in developing economies reliant on manufacturing employment for their workforce, export revenues, and foreign exchange earnings. The implications extend beyond simple factory closures to encompassing loss of technological capability development, reduced employment opportunities for working populations, and decreased government revenue from reduced industrial taxation. Currency and monetary policy represents the deepest structural dimension of this entire reorganization. According to monetary economists and central banking specialists at leading financial institutions and universities, central banks globally maintain dollar reserves for multiple interconnected reasons rooted in post-World War II financial architecture. After Bretton Woods ended, dollar dominance persisted through institutional inertia, the size of American financial markets, military backing of dollar systems, and critically, because petroleum trades in dollars. If you want to purchase petroleum, you need dollars. Therefore, every central bank maintains dollar reserves as a matter of basic economic necessity for maintaining stable energy supplies. This is documented extensively in Federal Reserve publications, IMF working papers, and international monetary literature spanning decades. When petroleum supply becomes allocated through Board of Peace mechanisms, something subtle but profound shifts in the fundamental incentive structure for holding dollars. Central banks no longer maintain dollars primarily because petroleum requires dollars through organic market necessity. They maintain dollars because the Board of Peace requires dollars as the participation mechanism for accessing allocated energy supplies at economically viable rates. This transforms dollars from organic demand currency rooted in genuine economic necessity into structurally enforced currency rooted in political mechanism. Monetary economists at Stanford and the University of Chicago published detailed analyses examining whether structurally enforced currency demand is functionally equivalent to organic market demand for purposes of monetary policy implementation. The scholarly consensus is nuanced and important. Structurally enforced demand creates similar monetary effects in the short term, particularly through mechanisms of seigniorage extraction and capital flows, but generates different long-term dynamics because structurally enforced systems remain subject to potential political reversal or negotiated modification. This permits what economists term quasi-unlimited monetary expansion. Traditionally, excessive currency printing causes goods price inflation. But when resource allocation is centrally controlled and pricing is administratively determined, currency expansion occurs without concurrent goods price inflation. Instead, inflation manifests in financial asset prices. Wealthy individuals experience asset appreciation. Working individuals dependent on wage income experience stagnant real wages. Inequality expands despite price stability. This is documented across academic literature examining planned economies and mixed systems with significant state resource control. Whether this represents legitimately concerning dynamic or necessary adaptation depends on political philosophy. The central question becomes, why January 2026? Energy analysts at IHS Markit and McKinsey documented that the preceding decade witnessed accelerating erosion of dollar dominance in petroleum markets. Chinese infrastructure investments reached critical mass around 2025. Alternative settlement currencies, including Chinese yuan and Russian ruble, began capturing increasing percentages of bilateral petroleum trade. Mathematical models examining currency substitution dynamics suggested the dollar would lose its position as dominant petroleum settlement currency within 5 to 10 years if trajectories continued. This is projection based on documented financial flows, not speculation. International relations scholars at major universities documented that American hegemonic power rests fundamentally on currency dominance and financial system control. If the dollar ceased being dominant petroleum settlement currency, American capacity to impose economic sanctions, control capital flows, and extract seigniorage through currency printing would diminish substantially. This is mainstream international relations scholarship published in peer-reviewed journals. From Washington perspective, this operation represents attempted trajectory alteration. From alternative perspectives, it represents accelerated decline mischaracterized as consolidation. One concerning dimension involves legal precedents created. The Supreme Court decision regarding suspension of sovereign immunity potentially opens doors to expanded intervention capacity. Critics cite historical examples where similarly vague criteria enabled unwarranted military intervention. Supporters counter that international systems require mechanisms for confronting genuine collective security threats. This is genuine debate in international law scholarship with legitimate arguments on multiple sides. Both nations accelerated infrastructure investment and alternative institutional development. China announced expanded Belt and Road Initiative commitments. Russia accelerated integration with Chinese financial systems. Both promoted multipolar development frameworks where nations retain greater autonomy. Whether one views this as genuine alternative development or competing imperial framework depends on analytical perspective. Empirically, alternative arrangements do offer genuine choice to developing nations, representing genuine structural change in global power distribution. If you are a consumer in a Board of Peace nation, you likely experience relative price stability of essential goods, while financial assets denominated in dollars slowly appreciate. For individuals whose wealth is in financial assets, this system generates accumulation. For wage-dependent individuals, this system creates stagnation relative to asset holders. If you are in alternative framework nations, you experience different dynamics. Energy costs might be lower due to alternative supply arrangements, but access to manufactured goods, pharmaceuticals, and advanced technologies might be more limited or expensive if controlled through Board of Peace mechanisms. Employment implications are equally complex. If manufacturing shifts based on energy cost allocation, workers in regions losing competitiveness experience unemployment. Workers in regions gaining capacity experience opportunities. But these are often different populations in different nations, raising equity concerns. International development organizations published analyses expressing legitimate concern about uneven distribution of benefits and costs from structural shifts. The geopolitical risk dimension involves potential for conflict escalation. When multiple power centers develop incompatible frameworks and mutual dependencies reduce, accommodation capacity declines. Balance of power dynamics documented in international relations literature for centuries apply here. The question becomes whether incompatible frameworks coexist stably or necessarily generate conflict pressure. Scholars offer different analyses based on historical interpretation. Stabilizing mechanisms do exist. Mutual economic interdependencies remain substantial. Military escalation risks create incentive for restraint. International institutional frameworks continue functioning despite pressure. These mechanisms do not guarantee stability, but create countervailing pressures against catastrophic conflict. Environmental economists emphasize sustainability questions. Whether controlled through Board of Peace or alternative frameworks, petroleum consumption continues generating climate change impacts documented across scientific literature. Neither framework generated genuine transition toward renewable energy. Both appear competing for declining resources rather than developing alternative futures. This may prove more significant than geopolitical competition. What we have examined is not simple narrative of imperial conquest, but complex restructuring of global power, generating genuine trade-offs and uncertainties. The operation is documented and real. The frameworks are complex and multidimensional. The implications are significant and unfolding. The future remains genuinely uncertain. Geopolitical restructuring affects your economic circumstances through supply chains, currency valuation, employment patterns, and capital allocation. Understanding these mechanisms is basic literacy in modern economics. Recognizing different arrangements generate different distribution outcomes is application of basic economics. Acknowledging powerful actors shape resource allocation is realism recognized across institutional analyses. Subscribe for deeper exploration. Join membership for extended analysis. Support through donations. Engage critically with these frameworks. Seek competing analyses. Maintain healthy skepticism while developing genuine understanding of how power functions in the modern world.